Hey guys, this is Cynthia Yanoff, host of Pardon the Mess. Parenting can get messy, and that's why we're glad you're with us. Each week we have honest discussions with our guests about the ups and downs of parenting and the lessons God is teaching us along the way. It's fun, it's real, and it's biblical. We put our trust in a God who rescripts our mess into His greater message. That's the best parenting news we could ask for. Join us each week on Pardon the Mess as we walk the parenting road together.
Hey guys, it's Cynthia. Welcome to Pardon the Mess. I'm glad you are here, and you are going to be glad you are here too. We have Dr. Ken WIlgus on our podcast today, and he is a psychologist in the Dallas area. And a couple of days ago, a friend sent me one of his podcasts where he talked through the difference in fear, anxiety, and panic and how to identify it in our kids and especially in our adolescents. And it was so good that within a day we were trying to find him, and within a few days we had him scheduled to record on the podcast. I think he's that great, and I think his topic is that amazing for what we're dealing with just in life, generally raising our kids, but really specifically right now. I think we're all feeling the anxiety that comes with a new school year and working through COVID and all that we are facing right now. So it is not only a great word for you as a parent, but it is a great word for you as an individual. Just being able to define these different areas of our life, fear versus panic versus anxiety, what it looks like, how to counter some of that, and when we need to consider getting help. Dr. WIlgus has an amazing book. It's called Feeding the Mouth That Bites You, a complete guide to parenting adolescents and launching them into the world. We talk a little bit about the book in this podcast, but we have a second podcast where we talk strictly just about raising our adolescents. So be sure you check that one out as well. But we will link his podcast, his book, in our podcast notes. And I'm so thrilled to have a chance for you to hear from Dr. Ken WIlgus. Hey, Dr. WIlgus, welcome to Pardon the Mess.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Well, I'm so glad you're here. And I had a little cheat because I heard you on a different podcast and you were talking about a topic that is near and dear to, sadly, all of our hearts right now, anxiety and fear and all of that. And it was so good. And I told Jill that works with us, I'm like, find Dr. Ken, even though I know you live right by me. We're both in Dallas, but thanks for doing this.
That's really my pleasure.
It's interesting because you said something in that podcast I was listening to that I've already been thinking, and I don't even know if there's a question in this, but I think it's interesting how the pandemic has brought out an interesting side of all of us. And I almost think you couldn't have predicted how it's going to impact us. And I know you said how it's kind of been an interesting psychologist experiment to watch, but for some of us that are probably really laid back parents and tend to not sweat the small stuff, we've turned into maniacs over COVID, or some of us that maybe are really hyped up parents. It's funny to watch those parents that some of them are very like, oh, whatever, God has a plan, we're fine. It's interesting. Have you seen any themes in here or how this is playing out? How have you found it to be interesting?
Well, it is sad that I was saying that as a behavioral psychologist, when, the worldwide panic sets in, I find it interesting. How sad is that? That I'm just...
Yes.
But if you think about the people that in your life that have flipped out about COVID and those that haven't, you might agree, find the same thing I did. It's a little hard to predict who would have had a much harder time, which is important when you understand the difference between anxiety and fear, for example, because you would expect that your anxious friends or kids that are just that generally, just get worked up over everything. You'd think, uh-oh, they're going to really have a hard time with this. And it's not necessarily true, because with fear, it's really about what are you thinking about? And so different people have different perceptions of this otherwise invisible threat, really. And, you just can't guess who is it that's going to see this potential disease as something to really flip out about. And for some of the teenagers I'm working with that have real anxiety, it's been almost a relief, like, oh, good. So now when, I used to stay at home all the time and that was bad, but now that's the new norm. So great. And I'm like, no. Not great.
Yeah, not great. Not great. Well, it's true. And I wonder if some people that have struggled with anxiety, are like, welcome to my world, everybody else. Like,
I think that's probably right. Yeah. Yeah. Especially at least in the feel better just in my own enclosed environment, now you know what it's like for me. Yeah, I think that's true.
Totally. Well, and we will at the end, I think you can't help but wrap it back into a little bit of COVID, but I think just generally speaking, this is such a helpful topic that I think talking about what fear, anxiety, and panic and knowing the difference in those within our teens,
Right.
and you specialize in adolescents, but knowing that and describing it is really helpful. And when I heard you speak into it, I'm like, ooh, I even had my daughter listen to it. I have a teenage daughter. And I said, listen to this. And I have friends that have played it with their kids. So I think this is a good discussion because not only will it speak to your teens, but I think it also was very informative in my own life and for all my kids. Right. And so broad strokes for everyone listening to this, but let's just kick it off right there and say, what is fear? And then however you want to wrap that into versus anxiety, because I think those are the two. And then the outlier is panic, which I think, of course, we talk about at some point. But what's the difference in fear and anxiety?
Yeah, that's a good way to do it. Well, panic is almost an outlier. We can get to that later. But one of the things that's important for parents to know for children at any age, really, is that usually we think about when our child's fight-flight reaction is lit up in their body, they look scared. We usually assume that it's fear. And fear is basically what you're thinking about. You're thinking about a thing, and that thing has caused my body to light up. And the sort of cure, or at least the intervention for that, is to explain, no, honey, there isn't a snake under your bed. Let's look. See, there's no snake there. And then we assume or hope that the kind of body's reaction would slow down because I'm no longer thinking that thing. Mm-hmm. Well, that is usually true, especially if you're explaining something to a child, sometimes to teenagers, but as you know, you don't teach teenagers anything anymore. But if you're explaining something to a child, it can help calm them down. Well, anxiety is not like that. If fear starts in your head, in your thoughts, and then goes down into your body and lights it up, then anxiety is much the reverse. It starts in your body. And sometimes if you have no real thought associated with it, the anxiety in your body will almost kick off your brain to start thinking of things to be afraid of that aren't even realistic. I think I mentioned before, one of my early examples of this was in college before I had experience with coffee like I do now. And boy, do I have experience with coffee. I remember showing up at an 8 a.m. class and I thought, do we have a test today? There must be a quiz. What am I forgetting? And the reason I was doing that is because I had a lot of coffee with no breakfast and didn't realize that my body was really amped up. And so I was actually almost trying to think of a thing to fit what my body felt. Well, with anxious kids, especially kids that are what we call endogenous, that's the way they were born. That's their temperament, always been shy. Honey, go tell the man that you want fries with this. And no, you go tell him that kid. Their body just lights up very easily. And this is the important part. When it's anxiety, it is not helped to have a bunch of people saying, no, you're fine. Stop being afraid. That does not help the anxious kid. And with teenagers, it really annoys them because if you're, kind of anxious about everything, then you end up being kind of ashamed of it because it doesn't make sense. It's like, I know that there isn't anything to worry about when I'm going to meet this little group of people that I haven't, I don't know very well. I know I'm safe there, but tell my body that because it really lights up. So the important difference sort of is fear is from your head down and anxiety is really from your body up, if that makes sense.
Totally. That's so helpful. And so you mentioned like there's some kids that you just know early on, they're just kind of run a little more anxious. Yep. And so then there's some kids, and I have one in my house that has been laid back their entire life. And then at some point in life, kind of hit a patch where there's some anxiety. Is that normal? And is there certain things we're looking for, or even developmentally places where that tends to show up and that's like kind of isolated? Yeah.
If you have a 4 to 6 year old that is suddenly worried about monsters and having nightmares, well, don't bother to call your doctor because that's pretty standard stuff. There are phases in human development where anxiety is pretty common. And I say anxiety because, you think about children's fear of monsters. That's a good example of a thought that comes up from the way you feel. And it's a little different with children because that anxiety isn't necessarily indicating that there's a physiological abnormality, it's pretty normal that as kids develop their awareness more and more, then they kind of have a general increasing awareness of what might happen bad. Like kids will fixate on what if our house burns down, or what if someone breaks into the house, or even monsters. And that's a great example when you have parents trying to logically talk this 5-year-old out of their anxiety, which is really needs to be coped with, not talked out of. And so in those cases, there are normal stages of life when you go through real kind of anxiety that you expect to kind of go back down. Early adolescence is that way. A new self-awareness creates very often a social anxiety that is very generalized and can be really difficult. I mean, gosh, I remember 7th grade. It was awful. But those are also experiences that we expect that once you gain knowledge and experience, then that fear goes down. But I think the important difference is sort of like to think about, all right, let's just take the fact that I'm experiencing anxiety. My body is lit up. It really has more to do with trying to evaluate what is the thing you're thinking about. So if you're having this anxiety, we'll use the word anxiety, but it's because I'm pregnant and I haven't had my first baby yet, and I'm afraid I won't know what to do. Well, that's really fear. It's not completely rational. You can tell yourself, I'm sure I'll be fine, but that will go away with experience. If you go through, however, long periods of time, or maybe even your whole life, where basically I have periods where I don't feel it. Like I have teenagers and adults that they don't walk around their whole life feeling this anxiety, but their life is very small. I go from my room to my school, back to my room, maybe to the church or to the store, but then I go back. It's like this little habit trail that keeps me from feeling the anxiety. That's really beginning to limit your life experience, and that's when it's a real problem, more than your normal kind of phases that, like I say, you expect those to go up and then go down as the experience changes.
Yeah. And so I would think you probably work through it with your kids in different ways. If you have a child that's chronically struggling with some anxiety, I think that's probably, I'm guessing, a different approach than kind of these periodic developmental type things. I guess really in any case, if you see that you have a child that's struggling with some anxiety in their life, and let's preface this by saying sometimes they can't pinpoint its anxiety. You've already said, let's not try to rationalize out of it, but what is the right answer before we even seeking professional help, which I want you to speak into that too when it's time to do that. But what are the starting places for that?
Well, that's a good question. It starts with, and this is a big deal to me, what age child are we talking about? Too often parents will come to me with, well, I was told that you, and fill in the blank. Well, yeah, that's for an 8-year-old, but not for a 16-year-old. So if it's
let's
a child,
talk teens. Talk any of them.
Yesterday I was spending time with my granddaughter, who is 6. She's adopted from Colombia and had a very difficult early 3 years of her life that we don't even fully know all that she went through. So she has a lot of issues. One of them is pretty chronic anxiety that really lights her up. But you can tell it goes up and down different days, whether she slept, things like that. So with her, it's a combination. So she and I went out on a truck drive in my truck, and she is scared to death of grasshoppers. Well, it's not wrong for me to tell her, and I'll remind her, can grasshoppers hurt you? No, they're afraid of you, right? Right. But I don't keep pressing it, because we talk about how they can't hurt you, while I was holding her tight in the truck, because that's the only way she can do it. So, again, it's not like you never try to address the thing that an anxious child is thinking about, but don't expect that to bring it all down. Then as they get older, and this is important by adolescence at least, you want to start talking to them, give them the word anxiety. If a kid has felt chronic anxiety their entire life, this may surprise you, but they don't know that they're anxious. That's one of the things I like about working with anxious teenagers. Between about 14 and 16, very often I'm with them when they first really discover, hey, I don't think this thing that's going on inside me is going on inside everybody else. And so you give them the name. Yeah, that's the anxiety. And man, it gets tough at the beginning of the year, doesn't it? Or anytime there's a change. So you sort of then teach them to manage the thing in kind of like the patterns, the things that help when you don't sleep. Remember, bud, that really kicks it up. And it can be a little annoying for teenagers that, they're like, no, I don't want to talk about my anxiety. Well, but that's what this is. So you add that part as they get older with an anxious child, is to talk about not just the thing that they're fearful of, but begin to talk about, but I know that my explaining this isn't going to help, is it, buddy? Because it really lights up this time of year, and kind of help acquaint them with the anxiety. And you want to be the parent that is willing to walk alongside you while you learn how to manage this thing that is in you and not out here.
Yeah, that's so good. And, it's funny as an adult looking back, and don't anybody panic. This hasn't gone into my personal counseling session. We're all going to be okay. But I look back and I remember as a child, these things, like, my parents would travel between these two towns quite a bit. And I remember always in between the towns being nervous that what if I choked on something and there's no hospital? Like these weird things I can look back in my life, like who's worrying about that at 8 years old, that they might choke in the car? And it's funny. I tell my friends now, it's what you're talking about. I can see these little places that I had some anxieties growing up, but I didn't know that everybody wasn't worrying about the same things. And at one point I woke up, I'm like, oh, wait, that was anxiety. Like as an adult, I can look back and see. And so I just feel like having seen that in my life, and I think a lot of people listening will probably be able to look back at places that were actually anxiety. How do we help identify that in our kids? Because in a perfect world, they come to us and say, hey, I'm really feeling nervous about this or anxious, but a lot of times it's going to show up, I guess, in their behavior or maybe them not eating. But what are we looking for?
Yeah, no kid comes to you and says, I'm having an anxiety issue. That's just not a thing.
Right.
But the main thing to watch for is whether this tendency for them to get very lit up with anxiety interferes with their functioning. And that's really the line of determining whether I should go see a psychologist or a therapist. It's one thing to have a nightly routine that this child is comforted by and we go through. It's another thing to have to restart the routine 17 times because you didn't say it right when I said goodnight the third time. Remember, you're supposed to say. That's getting really a compulsive problem. Or a child that is shy but has one or two good friends, that's all right. But this child has no friends, no connection at all. And obviously this child, teenager, whatever, cannot go to school. That's when it's something you need to deal with. So mostly with kids, it's a matter of just keeping in mind at different phases that be aware of the difference between fear and anxiety. Don't bog yourself down in loudly, angrily explaining, you're not going to choke. I already told you that. That's not going to help. But also watch for that to go up and down with age and to get better with experience. And if it doesn't and begins to sort of bog your child down and really interfere with their functioning, well, that's a different deal.
Hey guys, it's Cynthia. I'm going to jump in here for just a minute. I know you're enjoying Dr. WIlgus. I just want to let you know that I am maybe borderline giddy about the fact that my newest prayer journal is officially available this week. And if you have not grabbed your copy, it's time to do that. Many of you followed us last year as we prayed each week for our kids. We even had a Monday morning podcast that corresponded with the prayer journal. This year's prayer journal, the theme is marked by prayer, because there's so much threatening to mark our kids, including anxiety and depression and fear and panic. And there's so much they face, but we want to be families and raise kids that are marked by prayer. And so join us this year as we pray topically each week, different areas of our faith over our kids. And there's even a spot to journal, and it is the prettiest prayer journal. I did not design it, so I can't take credit for that. I just wrote it, but I'm excited to get it out to you. So go to pardonamess.org/prayer. pardonamess.org/prayer to grab your copy, and we will get it to you just in time to start praying for our kids as they go back to school. Do you find that kids, they hyper focus on something too, if it's an anxiety issue? Like mine apparently had been choking when I was a kid, and I could probably point to some other things, but do they hyper focus on areas? Is that another way to see it? Like, why are we so obsessed over this particular test? You've always done well on these tests, that type of thing.
Yeah. And that's the right word. Those are obsessions. And you can obsess a bit about a thing. Like choking wasn't a rational thing. You might, if you could remember, you did see someone choke or on a TV show or something, but it tends to, it's not so much about the content as the quality of that kind of thought. You're looping around. And when you're reassured, it doesn't help. And when that gets really significant, someone with real obsessive problems, what you'll find is that they will be super obsessed about this thing today, but wait 2 weeks and they'll have a different obsession. Once they kind of get over that one, it doesn't mean that they're okay now. It will be replaced by something else. And just in case someone's wondering, yes, OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, is a subtype of anxiety. Obsessions is one of the things that anxiety kicks off. And compulsions are just basically physical things that you irrationally feel, if I can do this thing just right, don't step on a crack, whatever, it will bind my anxiety. And those are two different not very useful ways of coping, common ways of trying to cope with anxiety. But yeah, the thing you're talking about would be obsession. And that's pretty common for everyone at different stages. But depending upon the intensity and how long it goes on, it can be a real problem.
Okay. And then there are things just across the board that we can do to maybe head off anxiety. I understand a lot of it's chemical based and there's not a lot we can do, but are there things you mentioned, getting a good night's sleep, eating, or, exercising? Those are things that come to mind for me. Are there other things or tools that we can, one, do off the shoot to prevent it, but then, maybe things in the midst of it we can deal with as well?
Yeah. The funny thing is that most of the time, if I have a teenager that is extremely anxious, virtually always one or both of that teenager's parents have a significant amount of anxiety. Anxiety runs in my family. So does schizophrenia, but that's not relevant here. But the point is that we kind of have that biology in us. And so one of the things that can be helpful is for you to kind of gain an understanding of it within yourself. Men particularly with very high anxiety tend to be real ashamed of that. They're not going to say, I'm really anxious. They're just really irritable. And Grandpa just walked out when we were having this emotional talk. What's wrong with it? Well, you might get super anxious, things like that. So once you kind of understand it in yourself, then, for example, for little children, anxious kids are very comforted by regularity, peace. They can predict what's coming. It's funny. You can have kids as little as 5 and 6 that are like, what are we doing Saturday? What? And you're like, well, I don't know. What is it? You said we're going to go to. So knowing what's coming, being predictable, helping them to prepare for something, change that's coming, even a good thing, can all help some younger children. And then with teenagers, like I say, that's the time, young adults by 13, you really need to start trying, without pushing, not teachy, but just you start really introducing that, I think this is that anxiety thing. And they're not going to like it at first, but you teach them to talk about it and to think about the pattern so they can manage it for themselves.
Yeah. Okay. And so then let's hit panic before we wrap it back to COVID for a minute, but let's talk about panic. And so that's a completely different thing that comes up. And what does that look like?
Well, that's really the best way to think about it. Too often people think, well, I'm really anxious, and so I guess I have a lot of panic. Not necessarily. By the way, I have several very anxious teenagers that are they're in drama. They go up on stage. Anxious people can do things that are scary, jump out of an airplane, for example, because again, it's just because my body's lit up doesn't mean that I can't participate in stuff. Panic, however, so if we have a continuum, if fear starts in your thoughts and goes down to your body, and then panic is in your body, but maybe goes up into your thoughts. Anxiety starts in your body and then goes up into your thoughts. Yeah. Panic is just pure body. It doesn't really, people are often stunned by when a panic attack happens. You would expect that, when you went in for that job interview. No, I was finished with the job interview, driving home, and I had to pull over. So people are often surprised by when the panic hits. And it's better to think of that as almost purely physiological, because panic is when whatever stress you're under overloads your body's ability to handle that stress. and it creates, your heart is racing, you're breathing fast, you're sweaty, your chest hurts. And in the worst case, I always ask, did you think you were going to die? And the worst case, that is what you think. And so it's a really terrible thing to have. But here's the good news. You don't have to have that more than once, because there's good treatment for panic that's better than, quicker than any of the other fear and or anxiety. And that is talking to your doctor about a short-term medicine that can stop a panic attack in its tracks as needed. And for a lot of people, just knowing that I literally have this tablet that if I need to, I can take it and it will stop panic, no more panic attacks. I say that good news because, man, if you've had them or many of them, it is just really hard. And there's no need to kind of be patient or learn how to deal with panic. You need to stop panic.
Yeah. And it's cyclical, right? Like if you have a panic attack, you can then get so worried about panicking that it just kind of keeps going, right?
Secondary kind of obsession now about every experience of fear. And now in the back of your mind, you're thinking, is this going to create a panic attack? And that's when you need to be able to tap your little pocket and go, oh, wait, I've got my pill in case it goes there. And then that takes that whole secondary anxiety away.
Okay. So, man, I've learned a lot, even more from when I listened last time, but this is so helpful. And so here we are in this day and age of COVID, and everything's uncertain. And the things that we used to be able to say to our kids, like, don't worry about the grasshoppers, or they can have legitimate concerns, and really concerns that we don't know how to speak that much truth into other than biblically, which is the utmost truth, of course. But if we have kids that are getting ready to go back to school at some point, hopefully, and parents that are anxious about that and what it's going to look like now. And I just think through this and I think, okay, it started maybe as a fear for our kids or for us, a fear because there is a virus and people will die. And then it keeps going into this anxiety. I don't know if it can turn into anxiety, and maybe for some people it's become a panic, but what's the continuum looking like here? How do we identify where we are or even our kids are in this? And then give us a little bit of levity on how we're going to work through this the next few weeks.
What's so fascinating about COVID is that it is a potential, obviously, harm to us that is invisible. You ever think about if we could do something that lit up the COVID virus in, bright neon, you'd suddenly see hundreds of people walking in and out of a place with masks on, not touching, and there's nothing in there. Like, we're protecting ourselves against nothing. And then other people being foolish, like, hey, how you doing? Shaking a hand, and it's all around them. You just don't know where it is. So technically, the virus is a fear, because it's something you're thinking about that is lighting up your body. However, what's unusual is it's an unknown fear. And we're still at a stage months into this where people really seriously still do not know how dangerous and what should we do. And I find that fascinating because first, as a parent, you have to start with about yourself. Like, what does my faith have anything to do with this fear? And most of us, go through our Christian life discovering, oh, there's this whole new territory in my life that I don't believe in God at all. I thought I did, but apparently I am an atheist when it comes to health or whatever. And that's part of, sanctification, is just growing in knowing God's sovereignty over these things. So you really have to start. You can't give your children something you don't have yourself. And you really need to take more time, both in prayer, in scripture, but also with friends, Christian friends, to really kind of give you the reassurance, really to deal with that lack of faith. Then you can talk to your children more and be more patient with them. What happens a lot is a parent that's very anxious and sees their anxious kid, you'll find yourself yelling at your kid for being fearful, which is kind of silly, but their anxiety kicks off my anxiety. So you have to really deal with it yourself first. And I would think we should all be pretty patient with ourselves. It's tough. It is a difficulty, and we are weak faith people. It's something that, Jesus is cool with that. He's teaching us, but we get all, I shouldn't be like this. I'll say, when you mentioned biblically, that a common issue is a Christian adult or teenager will tell me they feel really guilty during a sermon that says, be anxious for nothing. And they feel like they're really failing in that. And I always tell them that kind of anxious means fearful, that if we really know God's sovereignty and his love for us, then 1,000 fears are calmed. That's A.W. Tozer, for example. And so that we should really work on. But the fact that your body lights up with anxiety, I don't think that's you sinning any more than me sneezing is something that is me, lack of faith. It's a different issue.
Yeah.
And so our knowledge, understanding God's love and his sovereignty can really calm our fears. But as for a generalized anxiety, I think we should be patient with ourselves. That's for many people, a lifelong process.
That's so good. All right. Well, I love all that you've said, but I think it's a good starting place for us just to talk with our kids about it. I think there's always places for anxiety. We've had, school shootings. We've had everything that, could go through our kids in schools. They deal with a lot. And so now with COVID, it's a lot. And I just appreciate you giving us starting points to talk to them about it, but also just to kind of, dare I say, self-diagnose in our homes what we're dealing with. So
Absolutely.
Thank you.
You bet. Enjoyed it.
Okay, Dr. WIlgus has a book called Feeding the Mouth That Bites You, a complete guide to parenting adolescents and launching them into the world. And we are going to do a separate podcast talking just about his book. So I know y'all loved this today. Do not miss the second podcast that we'll be doing talking about our teens and adolescents and launching them into the world. So thank you, Dr. WIlgus.
Thanks.
All right. I love Dr. WIlgus, and I hope that gave you some clarity in your mind like it did for me. And also just an opportunity to realize that we're all in this together, and these are some hard times. We're all feeling uncertainty and a little bit of fear, a little bit of anxiety. And I hope this helps you define it a little bit for yourself and for your kids. And I love some of the tools he gave us. And especially for me, it's spoken to me, not trying to explain away or rationalize out the anxiety that my kids may be facing, but just really hunkering down with them through it and understanding it with them. And so there's a lot in that podcast. I know I'm going to have to listen to it a couple of times. Be sure and check out the podcast notes where I link his podcast and his book. And then also we have a second podcast with him coming out that you're going to want to watch for that talks just about raising our adolescents, but he speaks specifically into giving them freedoms. And I think you're going to be surprised. It's interesting what he suggests we do from the time they're about 13 on. So there's a little bit of a tease so that you can grab a minute and listen to that podcast when it comes out as well. You guys, we're so thankful for you. We know your days are busy. So as always, thank you for joining us as we pardon the mess.